Hello, friends, and welcome to the space where we discuss business, landscaping, beer, and everything in between. I'm your host, Heather Gerard from My Landscape Artist here in London, Ontario, Canada. And this is Season 2 of Hops and Hedges. Stay tuned after each episode for a message from our sponsor, ext.tech. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now crack open a cold one, and let's dig in. There you go. We are now recording, and with me today is Dr. David Galbraith. Galbraith? How do we say your name? Galbraith?
There's a couple of ways. There's a couple of ways that it gets pronounced. My family is always just completely phonetic. Galbraith.
Galbraith. There you go. And you are the Director of Science at the Royal Botanical Gardens, and you've been there for 30 years now. Mm-hmm. Time flies.
In a few capacities, but yes.
Yep. So we've got lots of things that I want to pick your brain about. I actually met you when I worked at RBG for my second co-op. Yep. That was like 15 years ago now, something like that. Oh my gosh, how time flies. And so I don't know if you remember this or not, but when I was there at as a co-op, you actually brought in your, I can't remember if it was your camera or your telescope. And we were actually looking at the sun. Like you actually had something on it so that we could look at the sun, which I had never done before or since.
Yeah, I have sorry about this. I have a couple of telescopes, and we haven't done that series of little displays for a while, but for a while I would take one of the telescopes out on the front lawn, out in a public area. And that telescope can have a very safe solar filter mounted across the front of it. And yeah, it lets you look at the visible surface of the sun very conveniently, and it's quite fun.
That was so cool. And I still remember that. I just thought it was so neat looking through that. You can actually see the solar flares and all the surface stuff. Sorry, I'm not as educated as you. So if I sound stupid,
you have a life. That's why.
It's because I have a life. Oh dear. I did have a little laugh on your pre-interview questionnaire where I always ask guests for their words of advice, and yours is don't do anything I did.
Yep, pretty much.
Just laid it out like that. Don't do what I did. So, David, what is it that you did? Because I know you've been at RBG for 30 years, but how did you get there?
That's going to take another 30 years to explain. I'll start at university, or just pre-university. I mean, I was always into everything sciencey. In high school, also a lot of arts. I was doing a lot of fine art, filmmaking, and photography in high school, as well as every bit of science I get my hands on, and English as well. And so as an undergrad, I went to University of Guelph in their marine biology program. And it was neat, but again, I wouldn't recommend anyone doing anything I did because I went there on kind of a false premise.
Okay.
And the false premise being that I would come out of that experience and be all sorts of an explorer and things. And you're not that after an undergraduate anything. You are if you go out there and explore. And it's nothing to do with what school you go to or what you're studying. The other problem I had with the marine biology program, and again, it's no criticism of the university or the program, but I got to the final year courses, and my grades started going way the heck up, which was great because I was actually getting into what I was doing instead of being bored for 8 months of the year. And I was looking at what was going on in the courses because my fundamental orientation is conservation. And increasingly in the final years of the courses, they were about things that were called marine resources utilization and fisheries science. And I was not there to try to figure out how to build better trawlers or suck the life out of the ocean somewhere for some corporate profit. That's not why I was there. And so I ended up taking 5 years to finish my undergrad, and just a couple of credits short of the marine biology specialization but I had a lot of other things going on. Again, I mentioned fine art and things like that. I took several credits in fine art. Perhaps the strangest thing I did was to take and then teach the lab section of a course in human anatomy for artists. Was at Guelph, because Guelph has a human anatomy program, and that was an incredible privilege to be in that program. And it came close to me really making a pitch to go into medical illustration as a career.
Wow.
But part of me kept saying I'd rather do my own research than illustrate somebody else's.
Okay.
No, I know now some really wonderful people doing illustration, and it would have been a brilliant thing to do. But then I did things that, again, you can't replicate, and I'm not suggesting anyone try. In my last year of undergrad, I took a course with a brilliant professor named Ron Brooks, and Brooks unfortunately just passed away a year and a half ago. But he was teaching animal evolution courses in fourth year, and it was just, again, most mind-blowingly wonderful stuff I'd seen. And we got along really well, and he hired me as a summer student at the summer I graduated. And I was helping in the lab doing a few things, but the earth-changing thing for me was spending 4 weeks up in Algonquin Park at the Wildlife Research Station in Algonquin Park as a field assistant on a long-term study of the biology of snapping turtles. And these guys were just so amazing. When you get into what they do over time, how they move around, what they're doing in nature. Most people encounter snapping turtles when one of them is trying to cross the road or digging up a garden to lay eggs. But we were seeing them in a very natural kind of habitat on their terms and trying to understand how their whole populations worked mathematically. And I was very excited by that. Of course, that was the summertime. When we got back to the university in July, Ron said, "Well, let's get you into a master's program." Again, this would not have happened. That can't happen today, but he pushed the paperwork through, and by September, I was a master's student in his lab.
Wow.
Normally, you have to apply in February, and then it's all kinds of stuff, and he just made it happen, which was just amazing. So I spent the next 5 years in his lab at Guelph, doing more different kinds of biology studies on the snapping turtles primarily. And first as a master's student and then as a technician for a year or so. And also did a bit more teaching. And like, this is just, you can't, like I say, you can't replicate this.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe some of the advice. One of the most important things to do if you're going through graduate school is to find something that's exactly what you want to do. And this is hard because most of the time that professors have funded positions for grad students, it's what they want you to do.
Right.
And that makes sense because it's an expensive thing to do, and profs have an entire lab to run, and grad students are essentially labor in those labs. But I went to a conference in the summer of 1986 in a place called Springfield, Missouri. And I was thinking about, okay, I've just finished my master's. I've got a little bit of time. What would be cool to look at for a PhD? And I already had this exposure to this population of turtles and what they were doing. And the conference was on herpetology, amphibians and reptiles. And I started focusing on a few people who were doing interesting things and having lunch with them. And just asking, well, what do you see is going on that looks like an interesting opportunity for a project that could take 3 or 4 years? And I had lunch with a guy from England who had done interesting stuff with tortoises in the Indian Ocean. But he was also running or just setting up a conservation group at the University of Kent in Canterbury in England. And he had his ear on the ground for what was going on in England. And a bit further north in Leicester, there was a professor who had just invented an interesting lab technique called DNA fingerprinting. And the thing that was, there's a lot of really intriguing things about the turtles. You know, when you watch a female lay her eggs, you know that which egg came out of which female. She
Hmm.
lays right there. They are. You know who the mom is, but the question is who's the dad.
Hmm.
And we know, and we knew back then that animals like snapping turtles, females can store sperm. It's not that they have to they have sex right away. They can store sperm for years sometimes.
Wow, that long.
Oh yeah.
Holy.
Um, and uh, what this technique was starting to be used for. Oh, I'm sorry, I had some almonds. I got a sort of scratchy throat now.
Hmm.
What this technique was being used for primarily was things like forensic science, like identifying a body or something,
Mm-hmm.
or a criminal. But it opened up the idea of looking at reproduction in animals and asking questions about their social system.
Hmm.
And a classic example is most people assume that many birds mate for life. They're faithful to their spouses or their mates or whatever. Turns out sometimes that's true and sometimes it's very not true. And the only way you can find out is by doing some kind of test on the babies and the parents. So in the snapping turtles, we knew that the females would lay their eggs each year in an area that was quite distant from where they hung out the rest of the year. They would do a migration to a nesting site, and that migration would take them through the home ranges of a whole bunch of male turtles.
Hmm.
And there was enough variation in what the male turtles were doing that we were interested, and arguably it could be linked to reproductive success, fitness. And the only way to get that is to figure out who's the father of the individual babies. So that was the goal. Try to figure out parentage in snapping turtles in Algonquin Park, and using these very funky lab techniques. It turns out that I have a case of ADHD that you could probably drive a Zeppelin through. And I've never been brilliant at fiddly fine work like the lab work that's necessary to do the DNA fingerprinting. I made it work. I was able to get some decent results, but I was not a natural lab rat. And I got to know people at Queen's where I did my PhD, and they're wonderful people who are far better in the lab than I will ever be. But I got far enough along that after 3.5 years, I'd proven some basic ideas. I tested a few things, and I got my PhD. And while that was happening, I was still in touch with the guy I'd met in Springfield. And he said, well, why don't you come over to Canterbury and do your postdoctoral fellowship in my lab? You can bring the DNA fingerprinting over and we can work on endangered species. So that, again, that really got me interested because I've always wanted to be in that ethical space of being involved with conservation. So I got over to the UK and I found I was completely in over my head. I was put in a lab, which was a bunch of lovely people. They were working on yeast. They didn't have much experience with the kinds of lab methods I had been used to, and nothing was set up. So I started to try to scramble and get lab work going that would do the same kind of tests. And we got linked into a really wonderful place on the island of Jersey called the Jersey Wildlife Preservation Trust. And they had some interesting parentage problems. Some endangered tortoises, for example, where if you could do parentage analysis, you could get better records of the genealogy inside the captive population. And that's really important to keep the animals from inbreeding.
Right.
So we set off to try to do those tests. And I only had 2 years in total. And the only reason why 3 of my 4 grad students finished their projects was that I was able to call on a friend who was doing this kind of work in a much more consistent way than I was. So the students finished up, which was great. And I came back after a couple of years. And on the way back, I was headhunted by the board of a little center that was based in Granby, Quebec, almost accidentally, that was working on trying to protect endangered snakes. And so for about 2 years, I was the executive director and curator of the Center for Endangered Reptiles. And it was a funny little thing that had been started 20 years before by a private philanthropist in Ontario. And again, another whole long story. The upshot was that at the beginning of 1995, the project kind of collapsed because of funding problems.
Mm.
And we were based out of a much larger zoo, and they were fantastic as kind of hosts for us. So my last action was to get the animals out to other collections and get the records secured and all of that. And then I had to fire myself.
Hmm.
And it was a pretty rough time because in a 6-week span, my father died, my girlfriend didn't come back from Fiji, and I had to fire myself.
Oh, geez.
And so I was up there in Quebec in an apartment on my own. And again, another amazing lucky thing came up, which was that one of the people I had worked with during my doctorate at Queen's gave me a call and said, well, actually, I have a project I'm starting down here in Burlington. It's to try to get these things called botanical gardens more involved in conservation projects. Are you interested? So I came down and I interviewed, and in April, I was starting at RBG, having never been at the place before the interview. So I started off at RBG with a background in biology, which was quite broad, with an intention to keep my focus on conservation issues, to be doing things for the good. Mm-hmm. And I had some experience by then with how various things like the Convention on Biological Diversity was unfolding. It had just been created a few years earlier. It came into force as a treaty in 1993, so it was all pretty new. And my job was to figure out how to get the botanical gardens across Canada interested in the conservation of biodiversity and especially of plants. And again, it may sound like an oxymoron. Well, why wouldn't the botanical gardens be involved in the conservation of plants? Mm-hmm. But for wild plants, there's much less of an emphasis on what might happen in a botanical garden than you might think. And certainly in Canada, the perception has always been that botanical gardens are not really involved in the conservation of wild plants. They just don't do that kind of work. There was a paper published last year by a friend at University of Lethbridge, and she surveyed about 240 plant conservation specialists across Canada and published a report on the state of plant conservation in Canada. And it doesn't mention the idea of ex situ conservation or botanical gardens. It's not on people's radar here. Wow. Now, that's different from the very big botanical gardens that are doing work in mega diversity countries. So if you're a Missouri or a New York botanical garden or a Kew, and you're rescuing wild plants from Madagascar, you're doing fantastic stuff with extremely rare plants globally. But most of the smaller botanical gardens, or again, I'll maybe say Royal Botanical Gardens is mid-sized. It's doing great work on its own in its own nature sanctuaries. That's really where RBG's strength is. Mm-hmm. But we've never launched a plant collecting expedition anywhere. We don't work in that space. And there's only a few places in Canada that ever have. It's a very different population of institutions. If you try to look at all of them together and figure out what they're about, they're not like the big flashy ones. And it's not fair to compare a place like RBG to something like Missouri Botanical Garden or New York or any of those guys. They do great. RBG does fantastic things, but it's not the same thing.
Right.
So we worked on that. We did get some success. We had a couple of great programs. Probably the highlight was by about 2003, we had a big grant to again forward this work, combine some conservation education work in the whole thing as well, with little grants right across the country for our participating organizations. But after that, it was hard to get ideas out of the group of gardens that we were working on. We'd done a lot of the things we set out to do. And the network that we'd built up kept going for another 10 years or so. But finally, by about 2025, that project was wound down. Mm-hmm. But by that time, RBG had put me on full-time staff in the science department. I started out at RBG as a contract employee. I was there 3 years on contract to do this networky stuff. And uh, they kept giving me other projects to get involved with, other duties. And then RBG went through some interesting transitions. And in 2006, our newly reminted CEO, who'd been with RBG a long time in another capacity too, asked me to run the science department. There had been an internal reorganization, and the library and the herbarium and archives and a little bit of research work and a couple of other things were all classified as being the science department. And so I became head of that group, and that's still what I am. And so that's now 19 years ago, which is just, again, I can't think about it.
The time just flies.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of the, believe it or not, the short version. All I can say is I kept making decisions that seemed like a good idea at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Things have kind of worked out. And again, I've been at this a long time at RBG, trying to do interesting things. My position is evolving. Our CEO wants me to be focusing largely on science communication now. And one of the reasons is that for decades, RBG has been doing totally brilliant things for nature conservation and especially in the nature sanctuaries. Hardly anybody knows about it.
Right.
And so the idea behind the science conservation work is to try to bring these stories out so that the general population, our members, everybody knows much more about what this place is.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of how I find myself bewildered and where I am today.
It was such an extraordinary journey. And the one thing you said, you just keep doing and you do things or try things at the time that you think, this seems like a good idea. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but all of those things led to where you are now.
Yeah.
Right? It's so fascinating. And it sounds like there was a lot of people on your journey that arrived at a certain time, that gave you a call, that invited you to England, that said, "Hey, I got this thing. Do you want to do this thing?"
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
They
And
say
it's
there's a saying in organizational management that if you're intending to innovate, you'd better be prepared to fail half the time.
right.
Because if you're not failing half the time, you're being too conservative.
Mm-hmm.
You're not taking the risks. If you fail much more than that, you're taking dumb risks.
Right.
But if you don't fail or learn from things or go off in a different direction within certain limits anyway, you're not taking the risks that you should be to try to blaze some new territory.
Hmm. There's a similar concept in sales, right? You need to meet or you need to be faced with so many no's before you get to a yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the same. Just in the previous podcast episode, actually, I was talking with Jared in Quebec. He's a sod farmer. And we were just or during our conversation, talking about how often we don't do any action at all, right? So it's like a whole bunch of little actions is going to get you to something, or something is going to happen a lot faster if you do a whole bunch of little actions rather than thinking about it and not doing any actions. Take those
Or
risks.
or getting stopped by thinking things have to be one big huge action.
Right.
Exactly as you're saying. I don't know if you've come across another management term called Kaizen.
Yes.
This is a Japanese management term, which means basically small incremental steps. And it's something I've been very interested in because I have been interested in organizational change. And I've been looking at where botanical gardens in Canada have come from, and they're all completely different things.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing as a standard botanical garden in Canada because
Right.
every one of them has their own history and purpose and governance and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But once they get started, how do they change? Because again, they do. And for each of us as well, there's management literature out there about applying all these principles and charts and everything that have been built up around Kaizen, even in your personal life as sort of self-development.
Mm-hmm.
So I see that as really key. Is you have to have a good idea of where you want to go, but don't assume you can drive there all at once.
Right. Or by yourself.
Yeah.
That's one of the harder things that's been for me. Is
Yeah.
that
Got to make
sometimes,
sure you know where you can stop on the way for coffee every half
yeah,
hour.
coffee or directions or a snack.
Yeah.
Um, Something you said earlier about when you were mentioning about plant expeditions and
Mm.
how RBG hasn't done any or that it's not really the norm. And my brain, also the ADHD, totally went on a little tangent. So do correct me if this sounds totally out to lunch.
Mm.
But aren't there a lot of local plants that are hard to find, that are hard to source, that are native, that we have here? We don't need to be going to South Africa for these plant expeditions. We could be doing expeditions right here in southwestern Ontario. Could we
Uh,
not?
you can, but the fundamental question is why. Um, and so my orientation on this may not be the same as someone who's thinking a lot about gardens or growing plants in cultivation.
Hmm.
I mean, we have about 150 endangered plant species in Canada.
Right.
It's about the same number as there are endangered animal species.
Oh my
And yet,
gosh.
most of the time, people, when they think of endangered species, they think of Vancouver Island marmots or some other endangered thing with legs or wings. Um,
Hmm.
but uh, the challenge in the thought process is asking why are these species endangered and what do they need to get them off of the endangered species list? And in almost every case, what they need is their habitat protected and the threats that are in front of them to be removed rather than growing them in a garden.
Hmm.
They're not threatened because they're not growing in a garden. And so this is why, again, I mentioned as I was talking about some of the background and the paper that Jenny McCune just published from University of Lethbridge, where she was surveying all these conservation biologists all over Canada, asking, well, how are we doing about Canadian plants? And they didn't even bring up the idea of growing plants out of their natural habitat. And that's a basic orientation of people working with endangered species in Canada. They don't, their minds don't go to that as an option,
Hmm.
at least not very, very often. Um, and uh, and again, it comes back to that asking the bigger question: why are the plants that we have here at risk? What's happening? And what would we do with them if we had them in cultivation?
Hmm.
Most of the plants in Canada that are at risk of extinction are found elsewhere. There's very few endemic plants, plants only found in Canada, that are on the endangered species list. And this has a really interesting background. Canada has a number of plants that are found nowhere else but Canada, but most of them are in one or two zones.
Hmm.
And the biggest of them is a place called Beringia, and it's in the Yukon.
Wow.
And it's a place which was not covered by glaciers during the last glaciation. And
Huh.
so the plants there had a long time to live and specialize. All the plants in southern Ontario, I mean, roll back the calendar 15,000 years, and there was 2 kilometers of ice here.
Right.
Nothing survived here. It's all repopulated since. And the plants that are here, which are endangered, are ones that have spread north since the end of the glaciation. And now we are losing the populations that are native here. I've been working on one plant that's a great example of this. It's called the wood poppy,
Hmm.
uh, Dilophorum diphyllum. It's a true poppy. It's native to Ontario. And the only place it's found naturally is in about 4 spots near London, Ontario. Um, and it's I mean, I just love this as a plant. It has very large leaves. I mean, much bigger than my hand, and they're dark green and they look like giant oak leaves.
Wow.
And they grow out of a corm in the ground, and the leaves pop out. You don't see it until springtime, and that's one of the first spring plants to come up above the leaf litter in the forest.
Hmm.
And they come up before the canopy closes, and they're sucking in sunlight until the canopy closes over top of them, and then they start flowering. And they've got these gorgeous yellow flowers that are about the size of a toonie, and some of them will flower for 2 or 3 months. Um, and there's The guess is there's about 600 individuals left in Canada.
Oh my gosh.
And we don't know exactly why. So one of the projects I was working on with Jenny McCune at Lethbridge, in fact, was some genetics on these guys. This goes way back to the beginning of my work at RBG, and another long story. But a few years ago, I was able to get some samples of this species that I had collected in 2001, all up and down the range in the US, to Jenny's lab, and she took over the lab work. And again, the upshot is that the plants that are in Canada are quite distinct from those in the USA genetically. They're a small group of plants. They are very like each other genetically. You go down to the States and the populations are all very different from each other. And in biology terms, this may be a bottleneck effect. So a few plants were brought north and they've persisted and proliferated, but they're all still relatives. But I have a question, which is, why are they here? Because these guys are spread by seeds moving around. For a poppy, the seeds are pretty big. They're much bigger than a poppy seed seed. And they're moved by arthropods. Ants or spiders pick them up and move them around. And in the wild, we see them moving the population, the group moving maybe a meter a year, maybe 2 meters a year. And so if you go back 15,000 years, there hasn't been enough time for them to go from south of Ohio to London unless people move them.
Right.
And they're found along the Thames River. And this is a true poppy. So if you crush it, you get this amazing bright orange sap out of it that you can use as a dye. And it's biologically active. If deer nibble on the leaves, they poop out all their worms. So but the thing is, it's not in any traditional knowledge that we know of today in Indigenous communities. But my guess is that they were brought into Southern Ontario by Indigenous traders or people moving them around for their own purposes in their communities long before the Europeans arrived here. And we're starting to see a growing awareness of this. I think, again, I'm a Western trained biologist. I'm not Indigenous. Yeah. And the assumption sort of was that, well, the Indigenous people were here, but they didn't change very much. We now know that Southern Ontario, for example, was radically transformed by Indigenous communities before the arrival of the Europeans. Before the era of Columbus and contact, there were probably 200,000 people working to cultivate maize in Southern Ontario. There's a project at the University of Guelph right now called Conservation Through Reconciliation. And they've been looking at the distribution of plants that are known to be interesting for ethnobotany all over the province, especially up and down the Niagara Escarpment region. And I'm certainly, again, convinced that a lot of these plants were actively moved by Indigenous communities long before Europeans arrived. And maybe those communities aren't there now. Maybe they've even lost the knowledge. But we can't assume that people weren't active. They absolutely were. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, we know even from RBG's lands, there were people here 10,000 years ago. Why wouldn't they have had the equivalent of gardens or propagating the plants that they needed for themselves, moving them around? They absolutely would have. And they were brilliant traders as well. Yeah. So they would move things. So the wood poppy is a wonderful thing to think about. And it's a beautiful little plant. And it's still endangered in Ontario precisely because its habitat is being mulched, not because of anything else. And people are bringing it into the province as a shade plant. But those plants are coming in from someplace down in the middle of the USA, probably Kentucky or Tennessee. And we know their genes are different. So if our goal in conservation is to protect the wild genes from the populations in Ontario in their ecological context, we got to work on what's happening in the wild and not necessarily have them, I mean, this is also an example of a plant that's really difficult to work with a seed bank. So most seeds fall into 2 bins. This is my symbol for bins. These are bins.
Yep, got it. Bins.
Bins. One bin of seeds are called orthodox seeds. And it's nothing to do with their religious beliefs. These are seeds that can be dried and preserved in a seed bank.
Gotcha.
The other group are called recalcitrant, and those are seeds that you cannot dry down. They die, and wood poppies are in that group. You can't preserve them very well as seeds. You can keep them alive for a season or two in a refrigerator in peat moss, but you can't dry them down like you can a bean and get land at the end of the day. So every one of these species presents a different set of challenges for how we think about what we're trying to do with conservation. And certainly organizations like the Canadian Wildlife Service and Environment Canada, which are responsible for conservation policy at the national level, or the MNR in Ontario, any of these agencies, Environment Ontario and the parks, their primary objective is to keep the animals and plants growing in the wild. And it's only under extraordinary circumstances that many of them have been thinking about other kinds of these processes that might be useful conservation tools. And I think they're going to be forced into thinking about it some more because of climate change. We're already thinking about that. In fact, we were doing it a decade ago with planting at places like RBG. We have a lot of trees on our property, both in the nature sanctuaries and also in the parklands and gardens. And if we're planting a tree today that has a 100-year lifespan, we better have a pretty good idea of the conditions it's going to be in 50 years. And selecting that tree on the basis of what we're expecting is happening now with climate change. Because we don't want to go on 50 years and suddenly find all the trees are dead. But where do they come from? We're looking further south. RBG and Hamilton and Burlington were right on the northern edge of the Carolinian forest zone. So fortunately, there's a lot known about the trees of the Carolinian forest zone. We can look south and east along the north shore of Lake Erie to find trees that are native to Ontario, but maybe better adapted to slightly warmer conditions. So people are starting to do that. There isn't a single obvious answer to it, but what's being called conservation translocation, which includes a variety of different kinds of methods, is, I won't say it's being rapidly used in Ontario, but people are thinking about it. Because what's the highest goal? For us, it's maintaining the habitat with native species in it. And for the nature sanctuaries. For the gardens, it's different. And one of the reasons why Royal Botanical Gardens is different from some of these others has to do with where its living plant collections came from. We have large living plant collections, and they're all almost exclusively from ornamental horticulture. So we have a large lilac collection in the Arboretum. We were doing a little bit of lilac breeding in the 80s, but by that time the collection was already almost completely assembled. They all came from other gardens and from commercial sources. So we're not going out there looking for wild lilacs very much. There are some, and one of our former employees, Charles Holotich.
I know Charles.
You knew Charles, yeah. He just passed away. I don't know if you knew. Last year, his daughters arranged a celebration of life at RBG. But and unfortunately, that's the period, right? I mean, so many of these people who were the mechanism of RBG, the thoughts, all of that, were active in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's now 30, 40, 50 years on. But Charles, in his retirement, was going over to Eastern Europe to look for wild lilacs, because most of the stock that's become cultivated were, from various places, somewhere between sort of the Eastern Caucasus and the west side of China, all the way through Central Asia is the kind of the homeland of the wild lilac. But it's not something that our particular organization has done much. Was, again, looking at the wild material. And that, like, each one of these organizations has a different background, a different story, a different set of purposes about what they're doing. And those things change over time too.
I think for me too, I mean, even though I am a landscape designer, so more often than not, I'm hired to do ornamental garden residential type design. But my mind goes to rewilding of areas. You know, when we come through and areas are being clear cut or um, we've got farmland that's being neglected, or if we've got lots that are just empty and sitting there, there's, I think, an opportunity that these areas can be prime real estate for these hard to find Ontario plants that would thrive in those kind of environments, right? So,
Yeah, it's so hard to know. I mean, again, historically, we know that we had a director of conservation at RBG in the late 80s named Peter Rice. And Peter's long retired, he's up in Ottawa. But uh, one of the things he tried to do as an experiment was to go around Southern Ontario and find rare plants and bring them to RBG.
hmm.
And none of them survived.
Ah,
He tried planting them at various places in the nature sanctuaries. He tried to line them up against their home habitats. Not one of them has survived.
hmm.
And it's again, I think it's because wild plants, like anything else, we might think of them as something we can pop into a pot and move around.
Hmm.
But they are living in a complex set of associations with soil microorganisms, with insects, with birds, with mammals, with other plants,
Yeah.
in particular soil circumstances, in particular drainage and moisture profiles, all those things. And I mean, it's great that we can do as much as we can with horticulture, but um, again, it's nothing to do with anything wrong with what horticulture does, except that I don't think we can assume that the plants are sitting around waiting to become horticulture.
Right.
And I think we have to use those tools carefully. But on the other hand, I mean, rewilding doesn't have to be focusing on the incredibly rare.
Hmm.
We need space for the things that aren't rare, or they're going to be rare.
Right.
And RBG is a wonderful example of that. The landscape that RBG owns, almost all of it was at one point farmed. Much of the land that wasn't farmed was strip mined. For example, if you remember where the Arboretum is, there's a huge amount of land immediately to the west of the RBG Arboretum that at the beginning of the 20th century was a clay pit. People had stripped the entire surface of the ground away so they could harvest clay to make sewer pipes. It was the Canadian Clay Pipe Company. And famously, the RBG Rock Garden was a gravel pit between 1860 and 1920 when it was abandoned and it became a dump. And then there was a big project between 1929 and 1932 to build this amazing rock garden by moving 10,000 tons of limestone from the Niagara Escarpment into the gravel pit because there's no native stone there at all. It's all transplanted stone. And it became this beautiful alpine rock garden, which then over time changed, in part because of the plantings that were done, or all the way around the rim of the rock garden, they planted Austrian and Scots pines. And as they grew up, they created a funnel effect that changed the microclimate in the bowl.
Huh.
And so it went from being open enough to support alpine plants to going to tulips and other things. It was too warm after these trees got to 50 or 60 feet to have a whole lot of alpine plants down there anymore. But that's what it was originally. It was a riot of heather.
A riot of heather.
There you go.
That sounds like your next book title.
Uh-oh.
A riot of heather.
You'll have to write the foreword.
Well, twist my arm.
So
well, we are
again,
running up to.
That's kind of some of the stuff that comes to mind. The idea of conserving plants is fantastic, but I'm not a garden person. I mean, like I've got that little oxalis here, and that's about it right now.
Yep.
But what's far more important is making sure that there is as much habitat with native species functioning ecologically, and if there are rare or endangered plants or animals that can make use of that habitat, it's almost best to let them find it for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the attitude we took when we were doing a lot of marsh restoration in Cootes Paradise about things like amphibians. I remember in 1998, we had a symposium at RBG about whether once we had done all this marsh restoration, we should start stocking the marsh with frogs. And everybody who talked about this said no. If the habitat is good, there's enough animals around, they'll populate it. If they don't show up, there's something wrong with the habitat, and you shouldn't just be dumping things in there so that they die.
Yeah.
So I've kind of been, my attitude's kind of been colored also by my experiences in the animal world too, where I think there are some great examples of really critical care cases. California condor is one, got down to 12 birds. And now there's several hundred because of captive breeding. Vancouver Island marmot is one that's doing well. The black-footed ferret is doing okay because of very carefully done breeding programs in places like Toronto Zoo and Calgary Zoo. But they're incredibly resource intensive. And everybody, I think, that's spending much time in this kind of space looks ultimately at habitat protection and working on the risks that are problematic for these organisms in the wild.
Yeah.
And hopefully, encouraging people to absolutely be engaged in gardening or rewilding projects. Another great example of that at RBG is Princess Point. 15 years ago, if you're out at Princess Point, it was a mown park. It was non-native turf grass and a few willow trees, and that was it. And then our natural lands department decided to convert it into a tall grass prairie. And ever since, there have been plantings of native species, and there are controlled ecological burns, and it is a lovely habitat dominated by things like Canada goldenrod now.
Yeah.
And the birds are back, and all kinds of wildlife is back, and it's no longer a large patch of grass. It's becoming something like a prairie.
If we build it, they will come.
If they have the chance. I mean, there's always barriers and things, but
yeah,
it's a long-term enterprise, and sometimes maybe there isn't the time to do some of these things. So, I think there are some great programs going on, trying to do things that are more kind of laboratory oriented.
Yep.
There's a wonderful program at the University of Guelph that you might have come across called GRIP, the Gosling Research Institute for Plant Propagation. And this is run out of the Department of Plant Agriculture at University of Guelph, and they're doing things like some manipulations and crosses to bring back American elm and American chestnut. They're absolutely honest about using biotechnology processes to try to bring back these trees that we've lost because of invasive species.
Right.
They also do things like cryopreservation and stuff like that. The guy that ran the lab, I'm not sure what his status is right now, Dr. Praveen Saxena, is a lovely guy. He was editing a journal out of the University of Guelph called Spiritual Botany, which was, or is, about the relationship between plants and people and religious belief and spirituality. But a lot of his research work was on protecting endangered plants of India, which are also medicinal plants, and using biotech to propagate them. Because there's a problem with a lot of propagation artificially for plants which people believe are really efficacious for things like medicines. It seems to be, but not necessarily universally, that the plants that are actually useful are the ones that are grown in the wild. And if you grow them in a garden or in a greenhouse or something, somehow they don't have the right juice inside.
Right.
And they don't do the same thing. Well, he was trying to figure out what actually was making those medicines useful, and then working on propagating those plants and giving the high-tech approach, but giving a boost to it all. So doing wonderful things up there at Guelph.
So I've got just a couple more questions for you. I know we're a little bit over time, but that's okay.
So you can do the
I'm
snip snip.
meh. This is gold. I want to keep all of it.
Okay.
Um, so a couple things, because with all of the work that you've done, and I know that protecting habitat's really important to you and conservation, and because of the background working in the labs and things like that, I'm wondering if do you have any maybe, I don't know, simple or easy, small, actionable items that somebody listening to this podcast might be able to implement to contribute to conservation without, I always fall into that analysis paralysis, that it's such a big undertaking and it's hard sometimes to not get overwhelmed with just how much work needs to get done. So
Yep.
what can somebody like me, you know, do to contribute
The
in a
most
positive
the
way?
most important thing is to do a little bit of research and shop around to try to find organizations that are doing good work that you can volunteer for.
Awesome.
RBG is one great example. We have volunteers who are out in the nature sanctuaries doing awesome things. Another one in our area here is the Hamilton Naturalist Club. The Hamilton Naturalist Club has been around since 1919, and they now own 7 nature sanctuaries.
Wow.
They have 1 employee. It's just a community group, but they survive by this incredible group of knowledgeable volunteers who are going out to these nature sanctuaries they've bought and doing the endangered or the invasive species removal. That's the biggest thing. Going in and pulling up the buckthorn and everything like
Yep.
that. So you don't have to try to solve the world's problems yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But if you find a group that you like working with as a volunteer, absolutely a fantastic way to start. And if you're interested in a professional aspect to it or going to school or something, the most important thing is to get some hands-on experience first.
Mm-hmm.
You can't necessarily just go to a university or a college and assume they're going to tell you what to do.
Right.
You should have, in my view, and this is where I got into this interesting situation all those years ago when I started at University of Guelph. I had no idea what it was to be a marine biologist. I was watching Jacques Cousteau on TV.
Yep.
And I found out after several years at Guelph that what I was training for in the marine biology program, as wonderful as it was not going to put me on the deck of Calypso.
Right.
And I think it's much better and much easier on yourself to find something to spend some time doing that you enjoy, that brings you into contact with the people doing the stuff. And volunteerism is one of the best ways to do that. Even more than making donations or whatever, people's time is so valuable.
Yeah.
And it gives you the experience of actually doing something hands-on. The conservation problems we have are big, as you were saying. I mean, climate change. What do you do as an individual about climate change? Nothing. You can make some good decisions about yourself, and you can lower your carbon footprint and all those things, and you should. That's great.
Yep.
Ultimately, it saves you money too if you do it right. But you can't expect to move the needle, as they say, by going from having a 15-ton to a 12-ton per year greenhouse gas equivalent carbon footprint as a Canadian.
Right.
But you can also inform yourself. You can ally yourself with organizations that are doing good work. I don't know. You're in the Brantford area?
I'm London.
London. Okay. Same kind of direction from here, but further.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look around for conservation organizations. The conservation authorities often have wonderful opportunities for volunteers
Yep.
to get involved in protecting sanctuaries that they own and manage. So again, I think that's the biggest thing I'd suggest is inform yourself, educate yourself, but get some fun, practical experience that's gentle.
Mm-hmm.
And joining a good volunteer group is absolutely the best way to start. And anybody can do
Love
it.
that.
Doesn't matter where
Right.
you are, right? It could be a 12-year-old, it could be 80. As long as you can walk out there and step on an extractigator, you're all set.
There you go. We have lots of different groups here in London. So that's Reforest London. We have the Thames Talbot Land Trust. We've got the Fanshawe Conservation Authority. We've got another one that's named after a body of water that I can't remember what it is called right now, but I will look that up. So lastly, I did want to end with congratulating you on your book. Am I getting this right? You have this, how did you put it? Your
So my
COVID
COVID
project?
project. I had a copy around here somewhere. So
Because
this was. Thank you.
that's awesome.
It's a 3-book set on the role of botanical gardens in plant conservation. I'm the second editor on the 3-book set,
Wow.
and it came up just as COVID was opening up, when the first editor, who is named Professor Pillai. He's out of India. Never met him, but I had contributed some chapters to some of his other book projects. One of them was on how botanical gardens are approaching invasive species issues. It was for an entire set of books on invasive species issues globally. And I wrote that with our herbarium curator, Nadia, here. Botanical gardens intrinsically move plants around. And historically, there have been quite a few examples of plants that have become invasive because botanical gardens moved them. So what responsibility do botanical gardens bear for addressing these problems today? So that was a lovely chapter to write. And I also wrote a chapter, a basic biodiversity survey of Canada. What's Canada's biodiversity all about, for another book set he did. And he wrote to me and said, well, look, would you like to do something about botanical gardens? Because this is fun. Let's do something. So foolishly, I said yes. At the end of the day, we published a 3-volume set. It's Tyler and Francis Rutledge Publishers. And it's called The Role of Botanical Gardens in Plant Conservation. The 3 volumes are arranged roughly geographically. So volume 3 is North and South America and Australia. And there's a chapter in there that I wrote about Royal Botanical Gardens and the conservation work that we've done, which again is largely focused on taking care of our own natural lands. But I also did talk about the context of what happens in the cultivated gardens. There's something like 60 or 70 endangered species in the cultivated gardens at RBG, but they're cultivars rather than wild plants. And so for the conservation people who are worrying about what's happening in the wild, they're not of any concern. Right. One of the volumes is largely on India and Central Asia. And that's because of Dr. Pillai. He was able to get an extraordinary response from the botanical gardens across India to contribute. So the whole project is about 45 or 50 chapters, most of them talking about the experiences and programs of different botanical gardens around the world in plant conservation. And then there's a few framing chapters. I wrote the general introduction in chapter 1 about what plant conservation is all about and what botanical gardens do. Paul Smith, who is the Secretary General of Botanic Gardens Conservation International, which is the big botanical gardens NGO that's leading plant conservation in so many places around the world. He wrote a chapter on networking, on how these organizations talk to each other and share information. So it's not just profiles of botanical gardens. It's a little idiosyncratic because it's not like we didn't try to line up every botanical garden in the world or cover every country synoptically. We didn't do that. We sent out introductions and invitations, and it was entirely, of course, up to individual gardens and workers as to what people at the gardens as to whether they'd want to contribute. And we ended up with 3 very nice volumes, and I'm pretty proud of it. Nothing like this has ever come out before.
It's pretty awesome. I mean, you sent me the link, and I'm going to include it in the podcast episode, so people should be able to look it up. But that is it's extraordinary.
There are some
the work that you've done.
Thank you. There are some wonderful books on botanical gardens out there, but they tend to be single author efforts that might look at a whole bunch of gardens they've visited, or take some particular slant on what's going on or the importance of conservation, and all those things are good. And I would just say everyone's library should be full of all those books. Right. Especially Chris Wood's book called Garden Lust.
Garden Lust. That does sound familiar.
You got to get that one.
Okay.
Chris Wood's an old friend. He's a lovely guy. He used to be the director at Chanticleer Gardens in the States. And since retiring, he's just running around having a great time writing things like a huge, beautiful, colorful book called Garden Lust about all the gardens that just really turn him on.
Love it.
But there's wonderful there's wonderful literature on botanical gardens and public gardens in general, and I am just really delighted to have made a contribution to that.
Awesome. Well, big congratulations again, David. It was absolutely awesome having you come on the show and hear more about your story. I mean, I already knew that you were awesome because I got to know you personally.
Thank you.
And during my time there at RBG, you gave me a few tidbits that really did help the trajectory of my life too. So having the opportunity for me to say thank you personally is pretty awesome.
Heather, I want to acknowledge that it's not every one of our interns or co-op students that I remember 15 years later. And one of the things that stood out for me was your willingness to have fun with the subject matter. So again, your listeners and viewers and people rubbing their screen for Braille or whatever this is, they won't know that one of the projects you got involved with when you were at RBG was you were going out to our metal shop and digging around in the garbage bins and making sculptures.
Yeah.
And you made these lovely little biomorphic things that looked like sea anemones or fronds or little animals. And you somehow convinced our guys out in the shop to let you do this.
Yep.
And you painted them up. And for a season, these were installed in the gardens in a couple of places. They were charming. And you are also a memorable person, Heather. I'm very glad to still know you after all this time.
Thank you for that little tidbit down memory lane. I had actually momentarily forgotten about asking permission to go through the metal bin before it went to the dump and rescuing pieces to make winter sculptures. Because I was living in Hamilton. It's like, well, I live here and I work here. I have nothing. I have no life here. I want to make something.
Well, and that's a great example of just looking at a situation and doing something unexpected. Nobody would have expected an intern or a co-op student to do something like that. And you had the flash and you went for it. And it was brilliant. So thank you for that.
Thank you. David, it's been an absolute pleasure. I look forward to seeing some more of your videos now that you're doing science education and awareness stuff.
I'm not sure it's going to be video, but again, my job there is to try to make sure more is coming out about what RBG is doing.
Awesome.
And we have a wonderful media communications group, so working with all those guys.
Well, if there's anything I can do to help in that area, you know how to get a hold of me.
Alrighty.
Okay. Thanks, David. I will see you around.
Okay, take care.
Cheers. That concludes this week's episode, hosted by me, Heather Gerard at My Landscape Artist. Now, before you go, here's some info about our sponsor, ext.tech. In today's fast-paced world, your landscaping business needs modern solutions to keep up with the change. That's where EXT comes in. EXT is revolutionizing the way you manage projects and streamlines your landscaping, snow removal, and construction operations. Instead of juggling 5 different software packages, endless spreadsheets, losing track of leads, and missing out on potential sales, you could be leveraging AI job routing, client management, and financial insights with a modern mobile app that employees love to use. With EXT's flat rate pricing, you'll never be caught off guard. If you're ready to revolutionize and grow your landscaping business, visit ext.tech today to learn more. And for additional savings, use the code HOPS10 at checkout, or just tell them that Heather sent you. See you next week for another episode of Hops and Hedges.